They laughed at him, shoved him, treated him like nothing. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. The bus ride to Ridgewood, Colorado, dragged on in silence. Miles slumped against the window, eyes following the changing landscape, busy city blocks fading into rows of near-identical houses, each one with the same neatly trimmed lawn, the same porch light glowing against the dusk. It wasn't his first time being the new kid, but this time felt different. His mom had taken a better job, and his uncle told him to think of it as a clean slate. But clean slates didn't exist when you looked like him in a place like this. The moment Miles stepped onto Ridgewood High's campus, he felt it, that brief lull in conversation as he walked by, the quick glances that flickered away the second he caught them. Teachers were polite, too polite, their smiles a little too practiced, their voices carrying that careful edge like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. He didn't react. He'd been through this before. The first few classes passed without much trouble. He took his seat, answered when necessary, and kept his focus on the work. No need to stand out more than he already did. But by lunch, the weight of all those glances had settled in, crawling under his skin like an itch he couldn't scratch. Tray in hand, he scanned the cafeteria. Most tables were already full, groups locked in conversations, completely uninterested in making space for an outsider. A few kids whispered, their eyes flicking toward him before darting away. Then he spotted it. An open seat near some guy glued to his phone, more invested in his screen than whatever was happening around him. Not perfect, but it would do. Miles had barely set his tray down when a voice cut through the cafeteria's hum. "You lost." He looked up. A blond guy, all easy smirk and overconfidence, lounged in his chair like he owned the place. A few others at his table watched, amusement flickering in their eyes. Miles exhaled slowly, didn't realize I needed a map. The guy let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Just checking, not a lot of new faces around here." Miles caught the hesitation in his tone, the part left unsaid. He met the guy's gaze, expression unreadable. "Guess I'm the exception." The smirk widened, but something else lurked beneath it. Amusement, curiosity, or maybe something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Welcome to Ridgewood, man." Miles didn't respond. He just sat down and picked up his fork. The message was clear. This was only the beginning. At first, it was nothing major, just a few side comments in the hall, whispered just loud enough for him to catch. "Didn't know they let guys like him in here. Wonder how long he'll last." Nothing he hadn't heard before. Nothing worth reacting to. Miles had long since learned that silence was the best response to ignorance. But Bryce Colton wasn't the type to let things slide. Bryce had the kind of confidence that came from knowing he'd never face consequences. His dad owned half the real estate in town, and his crew followed him like he was the second coming of royalty. Star quarterback, student body darling. The kind of guy who could do whatever he wanted and usually did. And for some reason, Bryce had decided that Miles being at Ridgewood was a problem. The first real test came at his locker. Miles was swapping out his books when a sharp shove knocked him forward. His shoulder hit the cold metal, the sound echoing down the hall. "Oops," Bryce said, voice dripping with fake innocence. "Didn't see you there." Miles didn't react. He grabbed his notebook, shut his locker, and moved slow, controlled. If he gave them nothing, they'd lose interest. Bryce let out a laugh. "You're quiet, huh?" "That's cool, real cool." Miles turned and met his gaze. Not angry, not afraid, just looking. For a split second, Bryce's smirk faltered. Then one of his friends, Nick, maybe Kyle, they all blurred together, muttered something under his breath, and Bryce grinned again. "Catch you later, new guy." Miles watched them walk away as the noise of the hallway resumed around him. That was round one. Round two happened in the cafeteria. Miles was heading toward the trash cans when a foot shot out in front of him. Not subtle. Not meant to be. Miles lurched forward, but his reflexes kicked in before he could fall. Laughter. Bryce held up his hands, all mock innocence. "Relax, man, it was just a joke." Miles didn't react, didn't even look at him. He just stepped over Bryce's foot and kept walking. More laughter. Someone muttered, "Too easy." Miles clenched his jaw. His uncle's words echoed in his mind. A lion doesn't flinch when the hyenas bark. He exhaled, let it go. But that wasn't enough for them. Because the third time, Bryce made sure it wasn't just a joke. And that's when everything changed. It was after school, and Miles had just wrapped up in the library. Most of the students were already gone, the parking lot half empty, no rush. His mom wouldn't be home for a few hours, and he didn't mind taking his time. As he stepped outside, he heard voices too familiar. "Hey, new guy." Miles barely had time to react before something slammed into his back. Hard. He staggered forward, catching himself before he hit the pavement. Laughter. Slowly, he turned. Bryce stood there, flanked by Nick, Kyle, and a couple of other guys whose names didn't matter. In his hand, Bryce still held his drink cup, the last few drops slipping between his fingers. "Damn, my bad," Bryce said, not even pretending to sound sorry. "Didn't see you there." Miles glanced down. Sticky soda soaked through his hoodie, ice cubes melting at his feet. A silence stretched between them. Other students in the lot had stopped to watch. Miles inhaled through his nose, steadying himself. Bryce smirked. "Come on, man, say something." Miles didn't. He just stepped past him. That's when Bryce shoved him, not playful, not a joke. It was forceful, meant to provoke. Miles stumbled back a step, his breath steady, his fingers flexed at his sides. Bryce laughed. "What, you scared?" Nick stepped forward, grinning. "Nah, man, he's just soft." Miles had spent his whole life hearing the same advice. Walk away. His uncle's voice echoed in his mind. Keep your hands in your pockets. Don't give them what they want. But this wasn't about a cheap laugh. Bryce wasn't just messing around anymore. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to prove something. Miles took one last deep breath. Then he set down his backpack. Bryce's smirk twitched. "Oh, you got something to say now?" Miles didn't answer. He just rolled his shoulders back. Bryce chuckled. "Man, you." That was as far as he got. Miles moved. One step in quick, controlled. A left feint, just enough to make Bryce flinch, then a sharp right hook. Straight to his ribs. The sound was brutal. Bryce's breath shot out in a choked gasp as his body folded. But Miles wasn't done. A pivot, an uppercut, perfect form. Bryce's head snapped back. For a split second, he tried to stay upright, but his legs buckled. He hit the pavement, hard, silence. Nick and the others froze, mouths hanging open. Miles stepped back, adjusting his hoodie. His breathing steady, controlled. Bryce groaned, rolling onto his side. Miles finally spoke. "You done?" No answer, just a cough. Miles glanced at the others. Anyone else? No one moved. He grabbed his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and walked away without another word. But what happened in that parking lot? It wasn't over. It was just the beginning. By the next morning, the whole school knew. Miles didn't need to check his phone to figure that out. The way people looked at him said it all. The stares weren't just curiosity anymore. They'd changed. Some were impressed, some were wary. A few looked at him like they were seeing him for the first time. Bryce, nowhere to be found. That didn't surprise Miles. Taking a hit like that in front of half the parking lot wasn't something you bounced back from overnight. Nick and Kyle, they kept their distance. Miles walked into class like nothing had happened, sat down, pulled out his notebook. Business as usual, but people weren't done talking. At lunch, as he moved through the cafeteria, conversations dipped into hushed whispers when he passed. People murmured. A few nodded, like they suddenly respected him. Some freshman kids who hadn't even looked his way before now acted like he was some kind of legend. And then there were the others. "Damn, didn't know the new guy had hands," someone muttered as Miles walked by. "Bryce had it coming," another voice added. "Heard he's not coming back for a week." Miles ignored it. He wasn't here to be a hero. He wasn't looking for validation. Then, just as he sat down, he heard something else. He's just another violent thug. Soft, but not soft enough. Miles turned his head slightly. A couple of girls at a nearby table, one of them a brunette with expensive-looking jewelry and an expression like she'd just smelled something rotten, looked away the second she realized he'd heard her. His stomach clenched. That was the thing about moments like these. No matter how justified you were, no matter how right the situation felt, someone always found a way to twist it. But he didn't regret it. Bryce had gone looking for a fight. Miles just made sure he got one. Still, the weight of it sat heavy on him. He had spent years training, years learning control, years choosing to walk away. That wasn't weakness, that was strength. So why did it feel like no matter what choice he made, people had already decided who he was? But Miles was about to learn that real strength wasn't just about throwing a punch. It was about what came next. The rest of the week passed in a blur. Bryce still hadn't shown up. His friends kept their distance. The stares faded a little. The whispers got quieter. But something still hung in the air. Miles could feel it. One afternoon, as Miles stepped out of the gym, Coach Harrison called his name. Got a minute? Miles hesitated. He wasn't in the mood for a lecture. But something in the coach's tone made him stop. They walked outside, stopping near the track where the football team was wrapping up practice. I heard what happened, Coach said. Figured you had your reasons. Miles gave a small nod. He wasn't about to apologize. Coach studied him. You a fighter? Miles shrugged. Been boxing since I was a kid. Coach let out a low whistle. Yeah, that much was obvious. You're good. But let me ask you something. Did that fight change anything? Miles looked at him, unsure where this was going. Coach crossed his arms. You think Bryce learned something? Think the rest of them did? Miles exhaled, running a hand over his head. He already knew the answer. Bryce wasn't the type to reflect. And as for the others? Some respected him now, some feared him, and some would always see him however they wanted, no matter what he did. Coach nodded, like he could read every thought running through Miles' head. Thing is, people like Bryce, they don't really lose, not in a way that sticks. He'll come back, he'll run his mouth, and the cycle starts again. But you're different. You have control. Miles frowned. What are you saying? Coach tilted his head toward the field. I've been telling the boxing coach to send me a few kids for wrestling. You ever thought about putting all that skill to better use? Miles blinked. Wrestling. Coach grinned. Look, I know you can handle yourself. That much is obvious. But there's a difference between winning a fight and learning how to own your power. I've seen too many kids like you get boxed into a reputation they never wanted. You already proved you're not someone to mess with. Now prove there's more to you than that. Miles didn't answer right away. For so long, fighting had been about survival, about refusing to back down. But the way Coach looked at him, the way he said it, this wasn't about proving a point. It was about becoming something more. That night, Miles sat on his bed, his uncle's old boxing gloves resting in his hands. He thought about all the times he had held back, all the times he had walked away, and the one time he hadn't. Coach was right. Bryce wouldn't change. People would believe what they wanted, but Miles still had a choice, and maybe, just maybe this time, he'd make a different one. Because real strength isn't just about knowing when to fight. It's about knowing what's worth fighting for. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe. Life is all about choices, and sometimes the hardest one is deciding who you're meant to be. Let's talk about it in the comments. Have you ever had to stand your ground? How did you handle it? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep this conversation going.